So we have now arrived to the 10th part of Alexander's Conquest series by Kings and Generals. This one's about the Battle of the Sogdian Rock. And yeah, let's just watch. Without any further ado, let's find out what more epic adventures and battles Alexander gets into, shall we?
Alexander's victory at the Jaxartes had secured his northern border. However, his choice to focus on the border meant that the revolt of Bactria and Sogdiana had continued, and that Spitamenes remained at large. The revolt would prove to be Alexander's greatest challenge, and would reveal some of his greatest attributes, such as his military flexibility and his mastery of psychological warfare, but also some of his worst, such as his brutality and pettiness. Today there's no one with as much power over your life. Before the Battle of Jaxartes, Alexander had sent Pharnaces to relieve the siege of Maracanda and bring the revolt of Spitamenes to an end. Pharnaces was only a translator though, not a military man. Alexander had assigned him the task because he thought that Pharnaces' knowledge of the local language and customs would allow him to negotiate with the rebels and help bring the revolt to a swift conclusion. To compensate for his lack of experience, he had also been assigned several of Alexander's officers to act as military advisors. When Pharnaces' force of more than 2,000 infantry and 300 cavalry closed in on Maracanda, Spitamenes pulled back. Pharnaces pursued eagerly, unaware that he was being lured into a trap. On the edge of the Sogdian desert, near the river Polytimetus, Spitamenes' army was reinforced by 600 Massagetae cavalry and turned to face Pharnaces. The Massagetae cavalry peppered the Macedonian infantry with missile fire and used quick hit-and-run tactics to harass their flanks. The Macedonian cavalry, outnumbered and less agile, was unable to drive the enemy off, and it was soon clear that the army was in a disastrous position. The infantry formed a square and retreated to nearby woods, aiming to cross the river. Without a decisive leader at their head, the officers assigned to Pharnaces communicated poorly, the cavalry crossing the river first and the infantry following without having been given an order to do so. The crossing was chaotic, and Spitamenes' force kept harassing the force as they crossed, some of his men managing to cross the—
This is giving me the same vibes that, when like Mark Antony invaded Parthia, or like, who was the third triumvirate member? It was Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, or Cass? I forgot the third guy's name, which is unfortunate because he's an important figure in history, but you know what I mean, when the Romans invaded Parthia and then just the horse archers kept shooting at them almost relentlessly, it's kind of giving me that vibe. So Pharnaces, unfortunately, like mentioned, ain't a military guy. He was there mainly in hopes of reaching a diplomatic solution. So unfortunately, he's kind of out of his league, right? Out of his depth in this situation. And Spitamenes is interesting in that after Alexander has defeated, the Persian Empire, essentially, and he thinks he actually has a legit chance of defeating Alexander, like, I don't know, it's like that kind of stupidity and hubris that kind of amazes me. I mean, granted, he's doing good right now, only because he's not facing the actual Alexander, who would have probably stomped him if he had shown up himself. Not even probably, he would have stomped him, like, quickly. So, I don't know. It's interesting, I think.
The river at other forts and attack Pharnaces from the opposite bank. Pharnaces' force was now surrounded, and the entire force of 2,000 infantry and 300 horsemen were either cut down or captured. It was the largest military loss Alexander's army ever suffered in Asia.
Yeah, but I have to give it to Spitamenes. Granted, like I said, that force wasn't really numerically great. Also, it wasn't actually led by Alexander, one of the higher ranking Macedonians, but, that was a pretty I could see that could prop his ego up, right? And dude, Alexander would be, I imagine he's gonna start raging. Like, after hearing that, like, I wouldn't doubt Alexander would want to just, like, fly into a rage upon hearing that disaster, right?
Alexander, returning from the Jaxartes and hearing the news, immediately marched on Maracanda, where Spitamenes had returned to besiege. Upon hearing of his approach, Spitamenes again retreated westward towards the desert, with Alexander in pursuit. Spitamenes began to withdraw further into the desert. Alexander, however, could not be so easily lured and turned his army back to Maracanda, burying Pharnaces' dead en route as best he could. Unable to catch Spitamenes, Alexander proceeded to carry out brutal reprisals on the Sogdians. For the rest of summer 329, his army devastated the area, burning fields of crops, and according to Rufus, Alexander ordered the death of all men of military age. The total number killed during this period cannot be known for sure, but some modern historians suggest that the number may have been as high as 120,000. Despite this, the revolt continued, and Alexander...
Yeah, that's insane. Yeah, Alexander was known for his brutality. I mean, yeah, he could be definitely kind, but I feel like once you cross him, he goes full on, like, brutal, you know what I mean? And I don't think that's a good thing when you're trying to unify an empire, or, you know, get people to like you. I mean, granted, I know that, like, all empires have to go through a point where you have to put down revolts, maybe send in a message that, yeah, you're not messing around, but I feel like too much of that might just make people completely resent you, so it's this weird balancing act, you know, that I kind of would want to, like I said, Alexander dying so young, I kind of wanted to see if he could have kept everything unified, and what would have been his long-term policies, you know? I feel like that's just an interesting thing that, like, Alexander obviously has a brain on him. He's smart. He, you know, he knows how to run things, but he also is someone I feel like who's ruled by his emotions a tad bit. Especially, like, the negative ones, like anger, where he could just, like, flip out on anyone. So it's, like, kind of interesting. I also heard he was kind of like a real drunkard near the end of his life. Like, really getting plastered all the time and stuff. So, like I said, I think it would have been interesting to see if Alexander would have mellowed out or just continued to spiral, and how that would have affected the empire if he had lived to, I don't know, let's say around 60. I feel like 30 more years, you know? It's one of those what-ifs in history, right? The great what-ifs, right? That unfortunately we'll never have a solid answer to.
Alexander found himself embroiled in a guerrilla war, unable to defeat his enemies in one decisive battle. To adapt to this, Alexander split his army into parts, under the commands of Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Perdiccas Coenus, and himself. This could be considered one of the earliest examples of a corps system.
That's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, yo, Alexander pulling out Napoleon moves, or rather, Napoleon was pulling Alexander moves. Yeah, this is like the corps system. That's awesome. That's like a kind of like sort of earlier sort of version of it. That's just smart, yeah. Like, again, Alexander's faced with guerrilla warfare, which has been the undoing of many great generals, right? Like Napoleon in Spain and etc. But I kind of like how Alexander has now dealt with this. Instead of, now he realizes he can't just have a giant pitched battle anymore. So he needs to, like, focus on speed and maneuverability and separate the army under competent... I know Ptolemy's definitely competent. Hephaestion, Alexander's friend, I think he can be trusted. I don't know much about these other guys, but obviously Alexander must have put trust in them to some degree, at least in their capabilities. So, yeah, the core system, that's just kind of really cool. I love the core system. I think it's one of the coolest things ever that Napoleon implemented, so I kind of love seeing that Alexander did it. I did not know this. Again, Alexander really is just great. This entire series has been me, like, fanboying over Alexander because of his genius, you know? And yeah, adaptability is a good word. Like, Alexander, the Phalanx is known for its rigidness and whatnot, but Alexander himself was so flexible with his army. He really is amazing. The man had adaptation. He could adapt, which is, I think, key in terms of military conflict. A key factor or trait. I'm sorry, I just ate a bunch of pizza, so if I sound a bit off and like full, Still though, I really love seeing that.
That Napoleon Bonaparte would use so successfully to his advantage 2 millennia later. Each of these corps would operate independently, suppressing any resistance they could. At the same time,
Only two cities have been identified: Alexandria Thermos, located in Termez, and Alexandria Oxus, located in Al-Qanam, Afghanistan.
Alexander founded a further 6 cities in the area to try and bring the province under control once and for all. However, even after he received reinforcements of 20,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry from the western satrapies and Greece, the revolt persisted. In the spring of 328, the army rejoined at Marikanda. The governor of the province, Artabazes, had asked to retire due to his old age, and Alexander accepted, appointing Cletus the Black as his replacement. While in the city, Alexander and his officers performed a religious ritual.
Is this where Cletus gets murdered by Alexander? I had heard that Alexander murdered Cletus because of an argument. Alexander was drunk, and I think the sources go that they had this argument. Cletus was shown out the door, essentially pushed away from a raging Alexander, but then Cletus came back, reigniting the issue, and then Alexander just murders him, which is another big riff among him and the Macedonians. He just killed one of their own, At least I'm not sure we're at that point yet, but I have heard that. And the reason for Cletus arguing, I had heard because he was essentially going to be removed from the main army and, to a less glorious position, and that in conjunction with some of the issues such as Alexander's Persian customs, rejecting Philip as his father, and more attributing himself as a son of Zeus. Yeah, at least that's what I've heard. I'm not sure if I got any of that right, but if we really are here, I want to hear that. Because the moment Cletus the Black got mentioned, everything just came back. I'm like, oh no.
Which, as was often the case, later developed into a drinking party. The sources vary about exactly what was said by who, but as the evening progressed and all the men became drunk, some of the younger officers began to praise Alexander, comparing him to Heracles, to the annoyance of the older officers. Soon after, Alexander himself even began to claim that he was superior to his father, Philip. At this point, Cletus, who had fought under Philip and whose sister had helped raise Alexander, spoke up, saying, "Alexander's deeds were neither in fact so great or marvelous, nor had he achieved them by himself, but for the most part they were the deeds of the Macedonians." Cletus even began praising Parmenion and criticizing Alexander for allowing Persians into his court. And
to be fair, this is really ballsy. I don't know how the relationship between monarchs and subjects were in Macedon. I know Macedon was kind of unique for having a king, but could you really just insult the king in front of everyone? That really was ballsy. Granted, they're all drunk, so they're probably more bolder than, but and again, I've looked at history forums. Some people kind of want to discredit Alexander, because Philip is the one who made the army. Obviously Philip deserves his praise. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying to completely write off Alexander's accomplishments and his deeds just cause he inherited the army, I think isn't right. But to completely ignore Philip at the same time isn't right either. They both kind of, it comes together, and I can see where Cletus is coming from. Yeah, Philip definitely does deserve respect, and yet the Macedonians, the army, there are times where even the army just due to their superior quality, saved Alexander. You know, like in that one siege with Memnon, where it was actually just the elite who saved the day rather than any tactical maneuver from Alexander. So obviously, yeah, definitely, I can see the point of view that, yeah, the Macedonians definitely are worthy of praise, and Philip shouldn't be disrespected, but at the same time, I think the way he went about it, straight up insulting the king, you know, there's a scene in that Alexander movie, you know, the one from 2004 starring Colin Farrell, where, like, Alexander and his, like, you know, commanders are discussing, like, his marriage to a foreigner, and then, like, they're, like, straight up, like, you know, disagreeing with him, talking to him, not in a way that we would think of, like, subjects talk to monarch with the utmost respect, but almost, like, frankly, like, friends, like, you know, like, a straight up disagreement, like I said, it's the relationship, because, you know, usually when we think of, like, monarchs and subjects, it's like, subjects have to speak to the monarch with respect, watch their words, don't say anything that could be potentially offensive, or else there'll be consequences. Like I said, I'm not sure if the Macedonians had that, or feel free to enlighten me if they did, but from what I've seen, you know, from the movies and from some sources, they weren't afraid to completely let Alexander know some of their grievances in a very frank manner, you know. But then again, this instance, everyone's kind of drunk, I feel, so things just slip out when you're a little inebriated, right? That's pretty it.
And embracing more Persian customs, at which point Alexander leapt up, calling Cleitus a coward. Cleitus retorted, "It was this cowardice of mine, however, that saved your life, god-born as you are," referencing when he had saved Alexander at the Granicus.
Holy crap. Dude, Cleitus clapped back, like, I saved you. Holy crap.
Alexander lunged at Cleitus, but was held back by his personal bodyguards, who also discreetly removed his sword, trying to defuse the situation. Alexander called for his other guards, but none came, and Cleitus was effectively dragged out of the room by other officers. With Cleitus gone, Alexander's friends tried to calm him, begging him to leave the matter for tomorrow. As they were doing so, though, Cleitus burst back into the room, quoting a line of Euripides, "Alas, in Hellas, what an evil government." Enraged, Alexander...
Holy crap. Yo, Cleitus was actually kind of saved for a second, but the dude came back and sealed his fate. Holy crap. Yeah, he got a bit too bold there. But at the same time, yeah, you don't disrespect the monarch, right? Like I said, I don't know the relationship between the Macedonian monarchs and their higher-ranking subjects, but, like, it just does seem a bit too brazen of what he said, that it couldn't slide without some type of repercussion, right?
Grabbed a spear from one of the guards and stabbed Cleitus, killing him.
Hello, I'm Patrick.
Alexander immediately regretted his actions and turned the spear around, about to kill himself, but was restrained by his bodyguards. They then carried the king to bed, where Alexander remained for the next few days, refusing food and drink, weeping and crying out Cleitus's name. It is important to understand that this was not just a case of a friend killing a friend. By killing Cleitus at a banquet where they had shared food and drink, Alexander had broken the rules of Xenia, the rules of Greek hospitality that were sacred to Zeus, who Alexander had been proclaimed the son of. Numerous attempts to console him, including from court historian and philosopher Callisthenes, failed. It was only when Anisakis, another philosopher, pointed out to Alexander that as the king of kings and son of Zeus Ammon, the laws did not apply to him in the same way, that Alexander was pulled out of his depression. Though Alexander...
Dude, you're a god. You don't play by the same rules that we do. And he's like, oh, okay, feel better now. Oh no, he's building up, they're playing the ego, right? Hey, wait, Alexander, you're above the law. And he's like, wait, I am, aren't I? So, But yeah, I've heard the hospitality being very sacred among the Greeks, or ancient Greeks, you know? And, yeah. Then again, like, some of the things Cletus was saying was a little out of pocket. I will admit, he did go a bit far with some of the insults thrown. Also, he was kind of dumb in that he came back after he was saved. You know? Hey, let me tell you one more thing, Alexander, and then gets stabbed. Oh, man. Wow.
Clearly did regret his actions. The death of Cletus does reveal a dark side to Alexander. Carney, a leading Alexander historian, has argued that Cletus's death, while not planned, may have been motivated in part by the justification that Anazarchus provided, that Alexander wanted to rule as the unquestionable king of kings, in contrast to traditional Macedonian monarchy where nobles like Cletus would often feel free to criticize their king.
Oh, thank you, kings and generals. You answered my question. So yeah, there was a difference. Like I said, I was thinking like the absolute monarchs, where you're not kind of allowed to straight up insult them, because like later on, you know, you can't imagine like a knight insulting the king and just being with impunity, right? But that makes sense. Yeah, the Macedonians would feel more free to straight up criticize Alexander, which is an interesting dynamic. You can just say, nah, king, you're making the wrong calls, you know? Like, an odd amount of freedom in that regard.
Moreover, as stressed by Worthington, the episode shows how petty Alexander could be, particularly when it came to comparisons between him and his father. While all this had been going on, Spitamenes and his Massagetian allies were still at large, having avoided Alexander's forces, and were harassing cities in Bactria, extracting bribes from some, and defeating at least one garrison that sallied out against him. Alexander again decided to split his force, sending part of the army into Bactria, forcing Spitamenes to retreat towards the Massagetae border. Craterus, in command of part of the army, heard of this and moved his force to try and catch Spitamenes once and for all, catching up to his 1,000-strong force on the edge of a desert. In the ensuing...
Dang, dude, he ran. Did you see how fast he moved? They must have been sprinting towards Spitamenes. Spitamenes' entire strategy is like such a trollish. He shows up, causes some problems, and retreats this way to the desert. Comes back. Like, his goal is a bit weird to me. Okay, Alexander ordered Craterus to garrison Margus to cut off Spitamenes' supply line. The town was later renamed Alexandria Margiana. I just love he names everything Alexandria. Like, dude, the ego is huge.
Doing battle, Craterus was able to secure a victory, but the majority of Spitamenes' agile force was able to escape, having lost just 150 men. Despite this setback, Spitamenes had, nevertheless, been largely successful in his guerrilla campaign, with even more men from Massagetae, increasing his force to 4,000. When Spitamenes and this army arrived back in Sogdiana, sometime near the end of 328 or the start of 327, they found the province well defended by the new forts Alexander had constructed, all with strong garrisons. Coenus, stationed in the area by Alexander with a force of approximately 4,000 infantry, 400 cavalry, and an unknown number of horse archers that had recently been added to Alexander's army, set out in pursuit. Spitamenes, seeing that there were no easy targets in the province to attack, finally decided to meet the Macedonians in a pitched battle near Bagae. The details of the battle are unknown, but the result was a victory for Coenus, Arrian giving his losses as being just 32, while Spitamenes lost 800. These numbers, particularly Coenus' casualties, are likely inaccurate, but it is clear that it was a decisive victory for Coenus. Spitamenes himself survived the battle, but was soon betrayed by the Massagetae, who cut off his head and sent it to Alexander to make peace. Spitamenes...
Yeah, maybe Spitamenes should have stuck with the guerrilla warfare. He was actually doing much better than before he actually decided to straight up give pitched battles.
had been one of the most tenacious opponents Alexander had faced, using guerrilla warfare to maximize the effectiveness of his smaller force, consistently avoiding being pinned down, and had even inflicted the largest military defeat on Alexander's army. His death meant that the end of the Bactrian Sogdian revolt was almost in sight, with only a few local tribes in mountainous citadels continuing to defy Alexander. The taking of these fortresses would require some of the most creative tactics in Alexander's career. The most notable of these holdouts was the so-called Sogdian Rock, a mountain fortress under the command of Ariamazes, where a number of rebellious tribal leaders and their families had sought refuge. Early in 327, Alexander left his winter quarters of Nautica and advanced towards the Sogdian Rock. On the march, however, a colossal blizzard swept in, and temperatures plummeted. Alexander ordered that huge areas of forest be cut down and burned to keep the men warm, and rode throughout the army, encouraging his men on. But nonetheless, the cold took its toll on many, some men freezing to death as they leaned against trees to take a short rest. The storm continued for 3 days, by the end of which 2,000 of Alexander's men had died.
Holy crap, dude. Oh my goodness, that's awful.
In time, Alexander finally reached the Sogdian Rock, which according to Rufus was garrisoned by as many as 30,000 soldiers. This number is remarkably high, however, and it is possible that Rufus had mistakenly included civilians in his counting. Nevertheless, the rock was widely considered to be unconquerable. It was well defended, with supplies to last a siege for at least 2 years, and was located in a strong defensive location, surrounded by steep cliffs and made even more secure by the winter snow that would make any assault particularly difficult. As a result of these factors, when Alexander arrived with his army and sent emissaries demanding Ariamazes' surrender, he was strongly rebuffed, the Sogdians laughing, claiming that Alexander would need winged soldiers to conquer the place. As the siege of Tyre had shown, however, Alexander was not one to be intimidated by the notion of a place being unconquerable.
What's the fastest way to get
Yeah, Alexander doesn't know the meaning of the word unconquerable. That word doesn't even apply to him. There is nothing Alexander cannot conquer.
Ariamazes had stationed his men on the walls facing Alexander's army, but had neglected to man the cliff at his rear, confident that such an approach would be impossible. Alexander seized on this opportunity. He requested 300 volunteers from his army who had climbing experience, and offered prizes to all who completed the climb, including a handsome reward of 12 talents to the first man to reach the top of the cliff. In order for the move to be kept hidden from Ariamazes, the climb would have to be done under the cover of darkness, making the already perilous mission even more dangerous. Nonetheless, Alexander got his volunteers, and after supplying them with iron tent pegs and ropes, they began the climb. It was a difficult ascent, with 30 of the men falling to their deaths, Alexander anxiously watching the top of the cliff throughout the night for the signal from his men that they had succeeded. At dawn, he finally saw his men at the summit, waving white sheets as had been prearranged.
Man, these brave men, dude, that's amazing. Like, doing things that people think are impossible, and I have to give props to these soldiers in particular of taking the task. Like, yeah, again, so much bravery in this era, you know?
With these men in position, Alexander moved his main force forward, and again requested Ariamazes' surrender. Again he was refused, until Alexander pointed to the top of the cliffs behind Ariamazes' position, saying that he did indeed have winged soldiers. Ariamazes, unable to tell just how many men were threatening his rear, surrendered without a fight.
Dang, this uses psychological warfare. Dude, Alexander straight G for genius and gangster.
Alexander's force marched in unopposed, and many of the Sogdian nobles were either captured or executed for their part in the revolt. There was only one last place of significance to resistance to Alexander, the Rock of Corienes, under the command of Sisimithres. It was also an incredibly well-defended position, surrounded on all sides by steep cliffs and a ravine, with the only path leading to the rock being narrow, steep, and easily defended. Once again, Alexander sent emissaries demanding the Sogdians' surrender, and once again he was rebuffed. Undeterred, Alexander prepared to take another place considered unconquerable. He first constructed ladders, allowing his men to descend into the ravine, where they began the process of hammering stakes into both sides. On top of these, they constructed supports, building a bridge and packing earth on top. Much like at Tyre, Alexander planned to construct a land bridge across the ravine so that his army would be able to attack from level ground. His army was split into 3 rotating divisions that continued to work day and night, but progress was nonetheless slow, thanks to the snowy conditions and harassing arrows from Sisimithres' men. Wooden screens were soon created to protect the workers, and Alexander's men continued the construction, slowly closing in on the Sogdians. To add to the growing intimidation, Alexander also brought up his siege engines in position to begin a bombardment of the defences. Before any attack began, however, Alexander sent a final emissary to the Sogdians. The emissary stressed to Sisimithres how dire his situation was becoming, and that once Alexander's causeway was complete and the siege engines began firing, his defeat would be inevitable. Disheartened, Sisimithres also surrendered without a fight. The taking of the...
Yeah, I love how he took them without any, like, a major bloody battle. Like, back to back. Wow.
Rock of Corienes marked the end of the Bactrian-Sogdian revolt. Soon after the siege, Alexander took his first wife, a local princess named Roxana. She and her father, Oxyates, had taken refuge at either the Sogdian Rock or Rock of Corienes, depending on the source. When Alexander first saw her, he is supposed to have fallen in love immediately, considering her the most beautiful woman in Asia. The marriage also served a political purpose for Alexander though, tying him closely to the local nobility and helping to subdue the unruly Bactrians and Sogdians. It had taken Alexander approximately 2 years to completely subdue the 2 satrapies, roughly the same amount of time that it had taken him to conquer lands from the Aegean to Egypt. It was, without a doubt, the most difficult period of Alexander's campaign so far, and cost his army the largest number of casualties. Approximately 5,000 of Alexander's men had been lost to Spitamenes' guerrilla tactics throughout the course of the revolt, and at least a further 2,000 to cold. The revolt had shown that Alexander was not only a master of tactical but also of psychological warfare, taking 2 supposedly unconquerable places without a fight. However, it also highlighted some of the darkest aspects of Alexander's character. Though often benevolent to his enemies, his brutal tactics in Sogdiana showed how willing he was to use fear and force as a means of control. Similarly, the murder of Cleitus showed that, despite how mature and reasonable Alexander could be, he could also be petty, hot-tempered, and tyrannical. His marriage to Roxana, though beneficial in the short term, was unpopular with many in his army, who now had what they considered a barbarian queen, and would prove to be a significant issue in the long run. With the revolt crushed, Alexander was the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. However, even during the revolt, Alexander was planning his next campaign. He would next lead his army beyond the borders of the Persian Empire and into India, and in our next episode, we'll talk about the famous Battle of Hydaspes, so make sure you are subscribed.
I can't wait to watch that. So yeah, next part is gonna be, let's see here. Personals. Okay, so next we're gonna be watching the Persianization of Alexander the Great. And yeah, I'll see you guys tomorrow when that comes out. Bye everyone.